What if you could take a step back and look at the world? Explore the line between certainty and doubt. You are listening to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen Stallone. Hello and welcome back, everyone. This is week 10. Yay! Happy 10-week anniversary to us. Well, I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to be jumping tracks from science to something a little more philosophical. And it's something that's been a debate in philosophy for pretty much as long as people have been discussing what existence is. And the question that we're addressing today is, what does it mean to be a person? What do you think? What does it mean to be a person? Does it mean to be a human? To be something that thinks, or is aware, or moves, or makes decisions? Well, be careful the way you answer that, because depending on how you describe what a person is, you're including and excluding many groups of not just humans, but beings, things. And I know this sounds a little confusing right now, but hopefully once we start explaining where the problems lie, we can explore better what it means to be a person. And why is that important? Well, the main reason it's important to decide what a person is or what constitutes a person, and I don't really like using labels, but this is one that we can't ignore, because what you define as a person is who or what you include in your moral community. So a moral community in ethics does not mean a community of people who act morally or ethically. This could be a meaning of the term, but it's not the meaning used largely. In ethics, one's moral community consists of all those beings that one holds in moral regard, or those beings that you need to think, but is this right, before you do something that could affect them. For example, if you tear a piece of paper in half, do you have to be concerned that it might not be right to tear a piece of paper? Most people don't hold paper in moral regard. If they have a moral concern about tearing a piece of paper, it's not for the sake of the paper itself, but because the paper might be an important manuscript or a bill of sale needed in a law case. Maybe you are concerned about the tree that was killed to produce the piece of paper. However, if you were to ask me to remove a limb from a child, I would have to ask myself, is it right to do so? Because a child is part of my moral community. A child deserves moral regard. I need to ask myself, is it right before taking action that will affect the child? Sometimes it might be right to remove a child's limb, as in maybe they have a horrible infection and we need to amputate. But such action should always be preceded by this ethical reflection. In the history of philosophy, different ethicians have argued for different extensions of moral community. For ethical egoists, they think that the correct moral community is himself or herself. If it is good for him or her, it is morally right. No one and nothing else needs to be given moral regard. The ethical egoist would argue that if everyone was an ethical egoist, everything would be fine. Machiavelli is a typical ethical egoist. He was also the author of that book that everyone references, The Prince. You know, it is better to be feared than to be loved. Another group is called the familiars, and they claim that only one's family deserves moral regard. Sometimes this extends to all of one's relatives or their tribe. Such persons are called tribalists. Ethnocentricists claim that one's moral community ought to consist of those like me. Some ethnocentricists are by nation, others by class or ethnicity. Anthropocentrists claim that the moral community ought to consist of all human beings. They would say that human beings deserve moral regard, and not just oneself or one's family or tribe. So only the beings that possess our genetic likeness deserve moral regard. This next group holds that all sentient beings deserve moral regard. This is a position held by Buddhist philosophers. Not just human beings, but any sentient being deserves moral regard because they're capable of suffering. Is it suffering that makes us persons? Such ethicists believe that we need to hold all sentient beings in moral regard and that our behavior towards any being capable of suffering should be governed by ethical norms. See, this brings up a lot of questions, such as how do we know that a being is sentient or that it is suffering? Last week, I did a show on plants, and we discussed how plants can feel pain and display signs of anguish when they are being mutilated. Does that mean that plants are sentient and that they are persons that deserve our moral regard? This is just something to consider. There are those that hold that all living beings deserve moral regard, and not just sentient beings. Living beings include plants and plankton, as well as fish, animals, and human beings. We can become aware of a person's moral community by listening to what they say when they're justifying a position. For example, many argue that we should preserve the rainforest. Anthropocentricists argue that we should save the rainforest because all it does and can do for human beings. Those whose moral community includes all living beings would say we should preserve the rainforest not because of what it can do for us, but because the living beings in the rainforest deserve moral consideration in themselves. There are also those who hold that all natural beings deserve moral regard. Stones and mountains deserve moral consideration just as human beings, animals, and plants do, just because they are natural. So from this viewpoint, you shouldn't spray paint rocks, but it's okay to spray paint canvases because they aren't natural. In addition, some thinkers add either previous generations or future generations to the moral community. For example, we should preserve the forest for the sake of the future generations. Finally, some add God to the moral community. They believe that we have moral obligations to God as well as creatures. But that position in itself is hard to justify because first you have to prove that God exists, which, as of yet, nobody has done so. If you're typical of many persons raised in a modern society, you've probably been taught several of these moral communities at different times or by different people. Look out for number 1, that's all that counts, or you need to take care of family. Others should take care of themselves. Law-abiding citizens need our concern. Criminals do not deserve anything because of their crimes. Americans need to stick together. The enemy does not deserve moral concern. Be kind to every human being. Animals have moral rights too. It is wrong to destroy a work of art. One of the basic steps in figuring out your code of ethics is to first clear up what you think your moral community ought to be. So, who or what do you think belongs in a moral community? How do you decide that? This is all a very deep subject that has many quagmires, and the answer may vary from person to person, so there's not really one accepted answer for what or who belongs in a moral community. So that in itself makes deciding what a person is nearly impossible, especially when you're trying to make it a universal concept. What if my idea of a person differs from yours, or from my managers, or from my teachers? So like I said, when you're deciding who or what belongs in your moral community, you have to be very careful because it's easy to exclude certain groups or include certain groups that you don't necessarily care for or about. Or maybe you care a lot about them, you just don't know how to justify keeping them in your moral community. So while your brain is chewing on that, we're going to talk about what personhood is. What does it mean to be a person? Defining personhood is a controversial topic in philosophy and law, and is closely tied with legal and political concepts of citizenship, equality, and liberty. According to law, only a natural person or legal personality has rights, protections, privileges, responsibilities, and legal liability. Now, we all know what a natural person is. A natural person is a person who's born naturally into the world, like you and I. A legal personality is something far more artificial. To have a legal personality means to be capable of holding legal rights and obligations within a certain legal system, such as entering into contracts, suing, and being sued. Legal personality is a prerequisite to legal capacity, the ability of any legal person to amend rights and obligations. In international law, consequently, legal personality is a prerequisite for an international organization to be able to sign international treaties in its own name. So legal persons are entities such as corporations, which are treated in law as if they are persons. While human beings acquire legal personhood when they're born, judicial persons do so when they are incorporated in accordance with law. So obviously there's some legal overlap into the status of persons, and it's questionable whether or not corporations should be seen as persons, seeing as they're just businesses or not a single entity, but in fact a conglomeration of many different people. But that's a whole different subject. Right now we're talking about personhood. And so far we've established natural persons and legal persons have these rights assigned to them by legal systems, which are really just groups of people that have decided what is best and who to treat what way. For example, what if there was a person born that was not natural? Such as a person being born out of an artificial womb, which may in the very near future actually happen. Are they a person? Or are they less of a person because they weren't born naturally? Anyway, according to law, only natural and legal persons have rights, protections, privileges, responsibilities, and legal liability. Personhood continues to be a topic of international debate, global debate even, and has been questioned critically during the abolition of human and non-human slavery, in theology, in debates about abortion, and in fetal rights or reproductive rights, animal rights activism, ethical theory, and in debates about corporate personhood and the beginning of human personhood. This topic is extremely important to the fetal and reproductive rights movements because when do we decide when a fetus is a person? Or what about animal rights? Animals are sentient, but are they persons? Processes through which personhood is recognized socially and legally vary cross-culturally, demonstrating that notions of personhood are not universal. I would like to describe to you some of the many different ideas about personhood through Western philosophers, but first, I want to read to you this fascinating article that I was assigned to read during my ethics class, which I think discusses personhood in a very in-depth, exploratory way. And, best of all, it incorporates Star Trek into this discussion. This article is on the Consortium on Cognitive Science Instruction website, written by David Anderson, titled, What is a Person? What is a person? The English term person is ambiguous. We often use it as a synonym for human being, but surely that is not what we intend here. It's possible that there are aliens living on other planets that have the same cognitive abilities that we do. For example, E.T., the extraterrestrial, or the famous bar scene from Star Wars, where there's hundreds of aliens gathered in the same building. Imagine aliens that speak a language, make moral judgments, create literature and works of art. Surely aliens with these properties would also be persons, which is to say that it would be morally wrong to buy or sell them as property the way we do with dogs and cats. or to otherwise use them for our own interests without taking into account the fact that they are moral agents with interests that deserve the same respect and protection that ours do. Thus, one of our primary interests is to distinguish persons from pets and from property. A person is the kind of entity that has the moral right to make its own life choices, to live its life without unprovoked interference from others. Property is the kind of thing that we can buy and sell, something that I can use for my own interests. Of course, when it comes to animals, there are serious moral constraints on how we may treat them. But we do not, in fact, give animals the same kind of autonomy that we accord persons. We buy and sell dogs and cats, and if we live in the city, we keep our pets locked up in the house, something that we would have no right to do to a person. How, then, should we define person as a moral category? In the long run, we may decide that there is a non-normative concept of person that is equally important and even conceptually prior to any moral concept. At the outset, however, the moral concept will be our focus. Initially, we will define a person as follows: any entity that has the moral right of self-determination. Many of us would be prepared to say, I think that any entity judged to be a person would be the kind of thing that would deserve protection under the constitution of a just society. It might be reasonably argued that any such being would have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This raises the philosophical question, what properties must an entity possess to be a person? At the Mind Project, we're convinced that one of the best ways to learn about minds and persons is to attempt to build an artificial person, to build a machine that has a mind and that deserves the moral status of personhood. This is not to say that we believe that it will be possible anytime soon for the undergraduates or even experts in the field to build a person. In fact, there's great disagreement among Mind Project researchers about whether it's even possible, in principle, to build a person, or even a mind, out of machine parts and computer programs. But that doesn't matter. Everyone at the Mind Project is convinced that it is a valuable educational enterprise to do our best to simulate minds and persons. In the very attempt, we learn more about the nature of the mind and about ourselves. At the very least, it forces us to probe our own concepts of personhood. What are the properties necessary for being a person? Many properties have been suggested as being necessary for being a person: intelligence, the capacity to speak a language, creativity, the ability to make moral judgments, consciousness, free will, a soul, self-awareness. And the list could go on almost indefinitely. Which properties do you think are individually necessary and jointly sufficient for being a person? Star Trek. Is Commander Data a person? To begin our exploration of this question, we shall consider an interesting thesis advanced in an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, The Measure of a Man. In that episode, one of the main characters, an android named Commander Data, is about to be removed from the Starship Enterprise to be dismantled and experimented on. Data refuses to go, claiming to be a person with rights. Presumably, this includes what we are calling the moral right of self-determination. He believes that it is immoral to experiment on him without his consent. His opponent, Commander Maddox, insists that Data is property, that he has no rights. A hearing is convened to settle the matter. During the trial, the attorneys consider the very same questions that concern us here. What is a person? And is it possible that a machine could be a person? In the Star Trek episode, it is assumed that anything that is sentient should be granted the status of personhood, and that Commander Maddox suggests that being sentient requires that the following three conditions must be met: intelligence, self-awareness, and consciousness. Captain Picard, who is representing Commander Data in the hearing, does not contest this definition of a person. Rather, he tries to convince the judge that Data possesses these properties, or at the least, that we're not justified in concluding that he lacks the properties. So what is intelligence? Before turning to the specific argument raised in the Star Trek episode, it will prove helpful to pause for a moment to consider the first property of the list: intelligence. Could a computer be intelligent? Why? Or why not? A careful consideration of these questions requires a very close look both at computers and intelligence. And so we suggest that you first examine a few fascinating computer programs and think seriously about the questions. What is intelligence? And is it possible for a machine to be intelligent? To help you reflect on these questions, we recommend that you visit one of our modules on artificial intelligence. So we're going over to the module, Artificial Intelligence. Can a machine think? And artificial intelligence? The word intelligence is used frequently and with many different meanings. In fact, we've defined cognitive science as the study of intelligent systems. Using the term this way, it must pick out a concept broad enough to cover virtually any type of cognition. But even if the term is fairly broad, and even if we sometimes speak as if intelligence admits of degrees, such as one thing can be more or less intelligent than another thing, it is still the case that intelligence is an important threshold term. That is to say, not everything qualifies as intelligent. Some things, like humans and German shepherds, reach the threshold that is required for intelligence, and some things don't, like rocks and vacuum cleaners. But what is it exactly that distinguishes those things that are intelligent from those that aren't? Soon we'll consider answers to that question, but first, there are some theoretical issues to review. Remember that the theory of the mind that we've focused most attention on is functionalism. The job of a theory of the mind is to tell us the fundamental nature of mental states. Mental states are things like your belief that it is Tuesday, my hope that the Red Sox win a World Series, and John's headache pain. But what are beliefs, hopes, and pains really? Well, according to functionalism, mental states are functional states. Computers are themselves simply machines that implement functions. And so, according to functionalism, mental states are like the software states of a computer. In theory, then, it is possible that a machine running the right kind of computer program could have mental states. It could literally have a mind. It could have beliefs, hopes, and pains. And if it could have a mind, then it could also be intelligent. All of this assumes, of course, that functionalism is true. But is it? Is it really possible for a machine to be intelligent? As we consider this question, keep in mind that a negative answer could give us reason to doubt the truth of functionalism. A positive answer would be consistent with its truth. So let's explore the question. Is it possible for a machine to be intelligent? Well, let's ask that question of the machine that you're presently working on. Could it be intelligent? To be so, it would have to have the right kind of software. So let's give it some artificial intelligence software. We are now going to turn your computer into an artificial agent named Larry. Go ahead, say hi to Larry. Larry does only one thing. He plays a game called Last One Loses. Since you will need to play the game with Larry, you need to know the rules. The game begins with 10 pencils. So here are the rules. On each move, you must take at least one pencil, and you can take no more than 3. Thus, you have 3 legal moves. You may take 1, or 2, or 3 pencils. The object of the game is to force your opponent to take the last pencil. The game is really that simple. Your job now is to play a few games of Last One Loses with Larry. First, play a few games with Larry going first. Then play a game or two where you go first. So, did you play a few games with Larry? He's pretty good, right? In fact, if you let Larry go first, then he beats you every time. But when you went first, how did you do? If you made a mistake on the first move, then Larry beat you again. But if your first move was the correct one, you may have been surprised to find that Larry forfeited. You might have thought he shouldn't have done that. He might have been able to beat me if he hadn't quit. While it is true that Larry might indeed have beat you if he hadn't quit, there is a reason why he quit. He knows that if you start and if you know what you're doing, there's no way for him to win. You see, he assumes that you are as smart as he is, that you know as much about the game as he does. There is a winning formula, and if you know what the formula is, you're guaranteed to win as long as you get to go first. We could also call the winning formula a winning algorithm. So what do you say about Larry? Is he intelligent? In a typical group, only a few people are prepared to say that Larry is intelligent, but this is often a vocal minority. Some of the things that are offered to support a yes answer to the question might be, he's intelligent because if a human plays that well, we say that person is intelligent. Refusing to say the same thing about Larry is just prejudice against machines. Larry is intelligent at the game, last one loses, even if he isn't intelligent in other areas. Or Larry might not be as intelligent as we are, but he is intelligent, because intelligence comes in degrees. When all is said and done, however, when you have studied all of the issues surrounding machine intelligence, you may agree that Larry is intelligent. But then again, you may not. A majority of students in the classes that we teach judge that Larry is not intelligent. Most students are not willing to say that he is intelligent, which does not, of course, mean that they're right, only that they are numerous. What reasons might one give to support the position that Larry is not intelligent? Or what answers might you give to the question, what are the best reasons for believing that Larry is not intelligent? Even if you believe that Larry is intelligent, it's still important for you to be able to explain the reasons that other people have for disagreeing with you. So now that we've thought about intelligence and pondered the possibility of machine intelligence, let us turn to the Star Trek episode again. You might find it interesting to note that while some people deny machine intelligence is even a possibility, Commander Maddox, the one who denies that the android Data is a person, does not deny that Data is intelligent. He simply insists that Data lacks the other two properties necessary for being a person: self-awareness and consciousness. Here is what the character Maddox says regarding Data's intelligence.
Is your contention that Lieutenant Commander Data is not a sentient being and therefore not entitled to all the rights reserved for all life forms within this Federation?
Data is not sentient, no.
Commander, would you enlighten us? What is required for sentience?
Intelligence, self-awareness, consciousness.
Prove to the court that I am sentient.
This is absurd. We all know you're sentient.
So I am sentient, but Commander Data is not.
That's right.
Uh-huh. Why? Why am I sentient?
Well, you are self-aware.
Ah, that's the second of your criteria. Let's deal with the first, intelligence. Is Commander Data intelligent?
Yes. It has the ability to learn and understand and to cope with new situations.
Like this hearing?
Yes.
Commander Maddox, though admitting that Data is intelligent, nonetheless denies that Data is a person because he lacks two other necessary conditions for being a person: self-awareness and consciousness. Before examining Maddox's reasons for thinking that Data is not self-aware, let's explore the concept of self-awareness. It is important to get clear about what we mean by self-awareness and why it might be a requirement for being a person. So what is self-awareness? Let us turn to the second property that the Star Trek episode assumes is necessary for sentience and personhood: self-awareness. This has been the topic of considerable discussion among philosophers and scientists. What exactly do we mean by self-awareness? One might believe that there is something like a self deep inside of us, that to be self-aware is simply to be aware of the presence of that self. So there's some being implanted within us that is driving our bodies around like a vehicle. Who exactly is it then that is aware of the self? Another self? Do we have two selves? Well, no, that's not what most people would have in mind. The standard idea is probably that the self, though capable of being aware of things external to it, is also capable of being aware of its own states. Some have described this as a kind of experience. I might be said to have an inner experience of my mental activity, being directly aware, say, of the thoughts that I am presently thinking and the attitudes that I presently hold. Even if we grant that we have such inner experiences, they do not by themselves supply everything that we intend to capture by the term self-awareness. When I say that I'm aware of my own mental activity, such as my thoughts, dreams, and hopes, I do not mean merely that I have some inner clue to the content of that mental activity. I also mean that the character of that awareness is such that it gives me certain abilities to critically reflect upon my own mental states and to make judgments about those states. If I am aware of my own behavior and mental activity in the right way, then it may be possible for me to decide that my behavior should be changed, that an attitude is morally objectionable, or that I made a mistake in my reasoning and that a belief that I hold is unjustified and should be abandoned. Consider the mental life of a dog, for example. Presumably, dogs have a rich array of experiences because they feel pain and pleasure, the tree has a particular look or smell to it, and they may even have beliefs about the world. My dog believes that her food bowl is empty. Who knows? They may even have special inner experiences that accompany those beliefs. However, if we assume that dogs are not self-aware in the stronger sense, then they will lack the ability to critically reflect on their beliefs and experiences, and thus will be unable to have other beliefs about their pleasures or their supper dish beliefs, what philosophers call second-order beliefs or meta-beliefs. That is to say, they may lack the ability to judge that pleasure may be an unworthy objective in a certain situation, or to judge that their belief that the supper dish is empty is unjustified. But if that is getting any closer to the truth about the nature of self-awareness, and I'm not necessarily convinced that it is, then it becomes an open question whether being self-aware need be a kind of experience at all. It might be that a machine, a robot, for example, could be self-aware in this sense, even if we admit that it has no subjective experiences whatsoever. It might be self-aware even if we deny that there is something that it is like to be that machine. To modify slightly Thomas Nagel's famous dictum, now let's go back to the Star Trek dialogue and see what they have to say about self-awareness.
What about self-awareness? What does that mean? Why am I self-aware?
Because you are conscious of your existence and actions. You are aware of yourself and your own ego.
Commander Data, what are you doing now?
I'm taking part in a legal hearing to determine my rights and status. Am I a person or property?
And what's at stake?
My right to choose. Perhaps my very life.
My rights. My status, my right to choose. My life. Well, it seems reasonably self-aware to me, Commander. I'm waiting.
This is exceedingly difficult.
We might well imagine that Commander Maddox is thinking about subjective experiences when he speaks of being conscious of one's existence and actions. However, Picard's response is still ambiguous. The only evidence that Picard gives of Data being self-aware is that he's capable of using particular words in a language, words like my rights and my life. It is only necessary that Data have information about his own beliefs to be self-aware. Or must that information be accompanied by an inner feeling or experience of some kind? Douglas Hofstadter has some interesting thoughts on the matter. In one of his columns for Scientific American on the seeming paradox of mechanizing creativity, Douglas Hofstadter wrote a thought-provoking piece about the nature of creativity and the possibility that it might be mechanized. That is, that the right kind of machine might actually be creative. While creativity is his primary focus, here, much of what he says could be applied to the property of self-awareness. The kernel of his idea is that to be uncreative is to be caught in an unproductive cycle or a rut, which one mechanically repeats over and over in spite of its futility. On this account, then, creativity comes in degrees and consists in the ability to monitor one's lower-level activities so that when a behavior becomes unproductive, one does not continually repeat it, but recognizes the futility and tries something new, something creative. Hofstadter makes up a name for this repetitive, uncreative kind of behavior. He calls it sphexischness, drawing inspiration for the name from the behavior of certain kind of wasp named a sphex. In his account, Hofstadter quotes from Dean Wooldridge, who describes the sphex as follows. When the time comes for egg-laying, the wasp sphex builds a burrow for the purpose and seeks out a cricket, which she stings in such a way as to paralyze, but not kill it. She drags the cricket into the burrow, lays her eggs alongside, closes the burrow, then flies away, never to return. In due course, the eggs hatch, and the wasp grubs feed off of the paralyzed cricket, which is not decayed, having been kept in the wasp equivalent of a deep freezer. To the human mind, such an elaborately organized and seemingly purposeful routine conveys a convincing flavor of logic and thoughtfulness, until more details are examined. For example, the wasp's routine is to bring the paralyzed cricket to the burrow, leave it on the threshold, go inside to see that all is well, emerge, and then drag the cricket in. If the cricket is moved a few inches away while the wasp is inside making her preliminary inspection, the wasp, on emerging from the burrow, will bring the cricket back to the threshold, but not inside, and will then repeat the preparatory procedure of entering the burrow to see that everything's all right. If again the cricket is removed a few inches while the wasp is inside, once again she will move the cricket up to the threshold and re-enter the burrow for a final check. The wasp never thinks of pulling the cricket straight in. On one occasion, this procedure was repeated 45 times with the same result. So initially, the Sphinx's behavior seems intelligent, purposeful. It wisely entered the burrow to search for predators. But if it really understood what it was doing, then it wouldn't repeat the activity 40 times in a row. That is just stupid. It is reasonable to assume, therefore, that it doesn't really understand what it's doing at all. It is simply performing a rote, mechanical behavior, and it seems blissfully ignorant of its situation. We might say that it is unaware of the redundancy of its activity. To be creative, Hofstadter then says, is to be anti-sphexish. To behave, that is, unlike the sphex. If you want to create a machine that is anti-sphexish, then you must give it the ability to monitor its own behavior so that it won't get stuck in ruts similar to the sphex. Consider a robot that has a primary set of computer programs that govern its behavior. Call these first-order programs. One way to make the robot more anti-sphexish would be to write special second-order or meta-level programs, whose primary job is not to produce robot-like behavior, but rather to keep track of those first-order programs that do produce the robot behavior to make sure that these programs don't get stuck in any stupid ruts. A familiar example of a machine caught in a rut is the scene from several old science fiction films in which a robot misses the door and bangs into the wall over and over again, incapable of resolving its dilemma, unaware of its predicament. A problem arises, however, even if it were possible to create these programs that watch other programs. Can you think of what it is? What if the second-order program, the watching program, itself gets stuck in a rut? Then you need another program, a third-order program, whose job it is to watch the watchers. But now we have a dilemma, what philosophers call an infinite regress. We can't have programs, generating far more programs than we would want to mess with, and yet still leave the fundamental problem unresolved. There would always remain one program that was unmonitored. What you would want for efficiency's sake, if it were possible, is what Hofstadter calls a self-watching program. A program that watches other programs but also keeps a critically peeled eye to its own potentially Sphexish behavior. Yet Hofstadter insists that no matter what you do, you could never really create a machine that was perfectly anti-Sphexish. But then he also gives reasons why human beings are not perfectly anti-Sphexish, and why we shouldn't even want to be. Can you see now why this kind of self-watching computer program might give us something like self-awareness? I'm not saying that it is self-awareness that is ultimately for you to decide, but there are people who believe that human beings are basically machines, and that our ability to be self-aware is ultimately the result of a complex set of computer programs running on the human brain. If one had reason to think that this was a plausible theory, then one might well think that Hofstadter's self-watching programs would play a key role in giving us the ability for self-awareness. Let's return now to the discussion of Star Trek and Commander Data, and the question, is Data, the android, self-aware? Whether you think that Captain Picard has scored any points against Commander Maddox or not, Maddox seems less confident about his claim that Data lacks self-awareness than he was initially, but that doesn't mean that Maddox is giving up. There's one more property that Maddox insists is necessary for being a person: consciousness. So what is consciousness? Must an entity be conscious to be a person? If so, why? What exactly is consciousness? Is it even possible to know for certain whether or not a given entity is conscious? While there are many different ways of understanding the term, one way is to identify it with what we might call the subjective character of experience. On this account, if one assumes that nothing could be a person unless it were conscious, and if one assumes that consciousness requires subjective experiences, then one would hold that no matter how sophisticated the external behavior of an entity, that being will not be conscious, and thus will not be a person, unless it has subjective experiences, unless it possesses some sort of inner mental life. Thomas Nagel discusses the significance of the subjective character of experience in his article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Note that Nagel's not concerned here with the issue of personhood. He most definitely is not suggesting that bats are persons. Rather, he is interested to deny the claim that a purely physical account of an organism, or of its brain states or whatever, could be, even in principle, capable of capturing the subjective characteristic of that organism's experiences. Nagel's main concern is to challenge the claim made by many contemporary scientists that the objective physical or functional properties of an organism tell us everything there is to know about the organism. That is to say, if we scan your brain and poke it and prod it and cut it open, dissect it, look at everything, chart it down molecule by molecule, and then recreate it, would that be you? Is you, yourself, all of your experiences, everything that it's like to be you, contained just in your physical structure? Or is it something beyond that? Nagel says no. An objective description of a person's brain states will inevitably leave out facts about that person's subjective experiences, and thus will be unable to provide us with certain facts about that person that are genuine facts about the world. One of his primary targets is the theory called functionalism. the most popular theory of the mind of the past 25 years. It continues to be the dominant account of the nature of mental states held by scientists and philosophers today. Before turning to Nagel's argument, you might want to learn a bit about functionalism. It's an empirical theory that has spawned a massive research effort that will, if it fulfills its promise, explain much about the mind that presently remains beyond our understanding. While functionalism dominates present research in the cognitive science, it remains a controversial theory. There exists a vocal minority who insist that functionalism fails to capture essential elements of the mind. It's worth noting that even those who reject the theory sometimes admit that there is no better empirical theory present on the horizon. These same people often agree that research programs built upon the assumptions of functionalism are enormously useful. Even if functionalism is eclipsed or amended someday by new theory, it's likely that any new theory will have benefited from the lessons learned by research programs that push functionalism to its limits. And so now we turn the spotlight onto functionalism, the most influential contemporary theory of the mind. If you see a machine that you've never seen before, you might ask, what is that contraption? What's its purpose? What is it for? In asking these questions, you're asking for an explanation of the function that the machine serves. In many contexts, when we ask, what is it? What we ultimately are asking is for an account of what it does. Consider, for an example, a mousetrap. If you know that someone has purchased a mousetrap, what you know is the function it performs. It's designed, either well or badly, to capture mice. There are dozens of types of mousetraps, from the familiar spring-loaded variety with cheese to poisonous chemicals placed in a mouse hotel. Knowing only that it is a mousetrap, you know nothing about how it performs its function or what materials it's made of, and for that you may not care, so long as it performs its function well. It is instructive that an expression has entered our language that focuses on the purely functional properties of the mousetrap. If someone is trying to create a new invention, a new method for performing a familiar function, we say they're trying to build a better mousetrap. We can say that the concept of a mousetrap can be realized, that is, made into a specific tangible object, according to many different designs and using many different materials. To borrow an expression from cognitive science, we can say that mousetraps can be multiply realized in different physical contraptions. As we'll come to learn, if functionalism is true, then minds can be multiply realized in different designs and different materials as well, but more about that later. Let's consider the function of an automated heating system. Its primary function is to produce heat whenever the air temperature drops below a predetermined level. We can say that the system takes as input the air from the room and gives as output heat as needed. If we assume that the heating system has been set for 68 degrees, then we can say that its function is to produce heat if the temperature is below 68 degrees, and to do nothing if the temperature is higher than 68 degrees. It takes the air from the room as input and gives heat or not as output according to a rule. Here we're treating the entire heating system as a black box. That is to say, we ignore what's inside the box. We're just concerned with the behavior of the system, not with its construction or the internal workings of its parts. Treating it as a black box, we know only what its output is in response to various inputs. If we get curious, though, and we want to peek inside the black box, we'll find whatever physical components are used to perform the functions of this particular automated heating system. As we examine the components that actually make the heating system function properly, we'll find that there are several distinct devices, each making its own unique contribution to the system. The system and most heating systems include the three following components: a thermostat, a switch, and a heating source. Let's take the first device, the thermostat. If we're interested in how the device is actually constructed, we can examine it so closely as to be able to write complete blueprints that would enable us to reproduce the device in every detail. Such blueprints would identify the dimensions of each separate component, it would specify the materials used to construct it, and it would also show precisely how all of the parts are arranged so as to operate properly. In the case of the heating system, we see that something like a familiar mercury thermostat is at the heart of the thermostat. A detailed blueprint would tell us what kind of glass the tube is made of, the shape of the glass, the volume of the mercury enclosed within the glass. A thermometer alone, however, does not make a thermostat. In addition to the thermometer, there would have to be additional components capable of reading the temperature on the thermometer. A photoelectric sensor would work, and a device for determining whether the temperature recorded by the thermostat was or was not below the temperature on which the thermostat was set. We might have an interest in the physical properties of the thermostat, but we might not. We might instead be interested solely in the functional properties. As a way of expressing this shift in perspective, we can imagine a black box which encloses the thermostat, hiding it from view. We can then do for the thermostat what we had initially done for the entire heating system. We can give it a functional description of the thermostat, noting only what it takes as input and what it gives as output, ignoring completely how it succeeds in performing that function. The function of a thing is often called its causal role. That is, the effect that it has on other parts of the system, and the effect that it has on the world around it. To speak of a function or the causal role of a thing is not to speak of how it causes certain things to happen, but merely that it does so. Just as we're given a functional description of the thermostat, we can do the same thing for other two key components of a heating system, the switch and the heat source. Each of the components of the heating system is represented in functional terms, not physical terms. We can see what goes into each black box, and we can see what gives in response to each input. If we pay attention, we may be able to discover the rule that it follows in giving a particular output for each input. For all this, we can see what it does, but not how it does it. Given that there are many ways to build a thermostat that performs the temperature detecting function, we say that a thermostat can be realized in many different ways. There are also many possible designs for a thermostat. So, how does this relate to the functionalist theory of the mind? So, functionalism is a theory of the mind that claims to tell us the fundamental nature of our mental states. Your mental states include everything from your fear of heights to your belief that it is Monday, from your desire to eat an ice cream cone to the sharp pain in your legs. Fears, beliefs, desires, and pains are all mental states. Your mental states include the cognitive processes that you're aware of being because they're accompanied by subjective experiences or feelings of some kind. But they also include the cognitive processing that you are not aware of at all, like the way your visual system turns simple two-dimensional line drawings into a three-dimensional world. So what does your desire for an ice cream cone and the pain in your leg have to do with thermostats and heating systems? Well, according to functionalism, the essential nature of your desires and your pains is not to be found in the stuff that your desires are composed of, but rather in the function that each performs. What kind of stuff is your pain made of? Are pains somehow made of molecules? Or are they made of some kind of immaterial mental stuff? According to functionalism, we can describe the essential features of our mental states without mentioning what kind of stuff it is made of. We need only describe what goes into and what comes out of each of the component black boxes. An account of a particular mental state, like pain, is complete when all of its functional properties have been identified. The stuff that's used to implement those functional properties is not essentially part of what mental states really are. Now, it must be said that virtually all contemporary functionalists are also physicalists. That is, they believe that everything that exists is ultimately built out of physical stuff, as described by our best theories in physics. Being physicalists, they don't believe in the existence of immaterial mental stuff. Further, even though a description of a mental state may not require any mention of the stuff which it is made of, it may nonetheless provide enormously helpful to carefully examine the stuff if you want to discover precisely what function the stuff performs. That is, if you seek a thorough account of the causal role of pain in a particular organism, examining the activity of nerve endings and pain centers in the brain may provide relevant data. Nonetheless, even though functionalists tend to be physicalists, they must concede that it's at least imaginable that pain could be realized in something other than molecules, just as we all must concede that a thermostat could be realized using something other than a mercury thermometer. Functional properties can always be, at least in principle, multiply realized. In our discussion of functionalism thus far, the word computer has not been mentioned. Yet, from the first time that functionalism was advanced as a theory of mind by the philosopher Hilary Putnam, who's usually credited with being its first proponent in a paper named Minds and Machines, written in 1960, it was explained using the computer metaphor. To say that mental states are functional properties, said Putnam, is to say that the mind is in fundamental ways like a computer program. Now, other people had already suggested that the mind was like a computer. In fact, the most popular theory of the mind at the time that functionalism was first introduced was a theory called the identity thesis. According to this theory, the mind was to be identified with the brain, and mental states were essentially brain states. Many who embraced this theory also appealed to the computer metaphor. They said that the brain was a computer and mental states were physical states of the brain. But there is a crucial difference between the identity thesis, according to which mental states are states of the computer's hardware, and functionalism, according to which mental states are states of the computer's software. If you define pain as a physical state, then no creature anywhere in the universe could be in pain unless it was in the same physical brain state that we are in when we're in pain. But that doesn't seem right. If you've seen the movie E.T., the extraterrestrial, you've seen an alien from another planet suffer to help save the life of a child. If we assume that the physical structure of E.T.'s brain is quite different from ours, which it would likely be, then it couldn't be in the same physical brain state that we are in when we're in pain. If so, then we would have to say that E.T. could not be in pain. But that doesn't seem right. Surely it's possible for E.T. to be in pain even if his brain is physically quite different from ours. Here is one of the main strengths of functionalism. Since mental states like pains are functional states rather than physical states, then pains can be multiply realized in a wide range of different physical states, and thus in all types of strange and wonderful creatures. Just as the term thermostat picks out a functional concept, so does pain. If something fulfills the function of a thermostat in a heating system, if it has the causal role that we described above, then it is essentially a thermostat. It doesn't matter what it's made of. Likewise, if something fulfills the function of pain in an alien from another planet, if it has the same causal role in E.T. that it has in us, then it is pain. It doesn't matter how the alien's brain is designed or what it's made of. It doesn't even matter if E.T. has a unique organ that can be described as a brain. It's still possible that the very same mental state implemented in us can also be implemented in E.T. So where does that leave us? Well, we know that many contemporary scientists and philosophers believe that your mind is very much like a piece of software running on your brain, which is the hardware. But that only tells us so much. Do we really know what a computer is? We see them every day, of course, but you may be surprised that there is quite a debate among scientists as to what things are and what things are not computers. Is your brain a computer? And if it is a computer, what kind of computer is it? The computer metaphor may offer a startling insight into the nature of our minds, or it may be another theoretical dead end. But until we get a clear idea of what computers are, we can't even tell whether the computer metaphor offers an interesting theory that makes a controversial claim about the nature of our minds, or whether it's a trivial claim that says virtually nothing of interest about our minds. We need to get back to what a person is, now that we've explored what functionalism is. Now that we have a basic understanding of that, here is Nagel's reason for thinking that a functionalist account of the mind would never be able to capture the fundamental nature of what it means to be conscious. Conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon. It occurs at many levels of animal life, though we cannot be sure of its presence in the simpler organisms, and it is very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. Some extremists have been prepared to deny it even in mammals other than men. No doubt it occurs in countless forms totally unimaginable to us, on other planets, in other solar systems throughout the universe. But no matter how the forms may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there is something it is like to be that organism. There may be further implications about the form of the experience. There may even, though I doubt it, be implications about the behavior of the organism. But fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if, and only if, there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism itself. We may call this the subjective character of experience. It's not captured by any of the familiar, recently devised reductive analysis of the mental, for all of them are logically compatible with its absence. It's not analyzable in terms of any explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, since these could be ascribed to robots or automated things that behave like people though they experience nothing. Side note, perhaps there could not actually be such robots. Perhaps anything complex enough to be like a person would have experiences, but that, if true, is a fact which cannot be discovered merely by analyzing the concept of experience. It's not analyzable in terms of the causal role of experiences in relation to typical human behavior, for similar reasons. I don't deny that conscious mental states and events can cause behavior, nor that they may be given functional characterizations. I deny only that this kind of thing exhausts their analysis. If physicalism is to be defended, phenomenological features must then themselves be given a physical account. But when we examine their subjective character, it seems that such a result is impossible. The reason is that every subjective phenomena is essentially connected with a single point of view, and it seems inevitable that an objective physical theory will abandon that point of view. But maybe Nagel is too quick to give up on this physicalist reduction of consciousness. There are scientific methods currently being used to explore the nature of consciousness. Here's a brief introduction to the scientific study of consciousness that you might find helpful. If an android is to be a person, must it have subjective experiences? If so, why? Further, even if we decide that persons must have such experiences, how are we to tell whether or not any given android has such experiences? Consider the following example. Assume that the computing center of an android uses two different assessment programs to determine whether or not to perform a particular act. In most cases, the two programs agree. However, in this particular case, let's assume the two programs give conflicting results. Further, let's assume that there's a very complex procedure that the android must go through to resolve this conflict, a procedure taking several minutes to perform. During the time it takes to resolve the conflict, it's appropriate to say that the android feels confused or uncertain about whether to perform A. If we deny that the android's present state is one of feeling uncertain, on what grounds would we do so? Colin McGinn considers this question when he asks, could a machine be conscious? Could there be something that it is like to be that machine? Very briefly, he answers, yes, a machine can be conscious. In principle, it's possible that an artifact like an android might be conscious, and that it could be, even so, if it were not alive, according to McGinn. But he argues we have no idea what property it is that makes us conscious beings, and thus we have no idea what property must be built into a machine to make it conscious. He argues that a computer cannot be said to be conscious merely by virtue of the fact that it has computational properties, merely because it is able to manipulate linguistic symbols at the syntactic level. Computations of that kind are certainly possible without consciousness. He suggests further that the sentences uttered by an android might actually mean something, that they might refer to objects in the world, and thus that they actually possess semantic properties. And yet still the android might not be conscious. That is, the android might still lack subjective experiences. There might still be nothing that it is like to be that android. McGinn's conclusion then? It is possible that a machine might be conscious, but at this point, given that we have no clue what it is about humans that makes us conscious, we have no idea what we would have to build into an android to make it conscious. Hilary Putnam offers an interesting argument on this topic. If there existed a sophisticated enough android, Putnam argues that there would simply be no evidence one way or another to settle the question whether it had subjective experiences or not. In that event, however, he argues that we ought to treat such an android as a conscious being for moral reasons. His argument goes like this. One of the main reasons that you and I assume that other beings have subjective experiences similar to our own is that they talk about their experiences in the same way that we talk about ours. Imagine that we're both looking at a white table and that I put on a pair of rose-colored glasses. I say, now the table looks red. This introduces the distinction between appearance and reality, central to the discipline of epistemology. In such a context, I'm aware that the subjective character of my experience, such as the table appears red, does not accurately reflect the reality of the situation, or that the table is really white. Thus, we might say that when I speak of the red table, I'm saying something about the subjective character of my experience, and not about the objective reality. One analysis of the situation is to say that when I say that the table appears red, I am saying something like, I'm having the same kind of subjective experience that I typically have when I see something that is really red. The interesting claim that Putnam makes is that it's inevitable that the android will also draw a distinction between how things appear and how things really are. Putnam asks us to imagine a community of androids who speak English, just like we do. Of course, these androids must have sensory equipment that gives them information about the external world. They will be capable of recognizing familiar shapes, like the shape of a table, and they will have special light sensors that measure the frequency of light reflected off of objects, so that they'll be able to recognize familiar colors. If an android is placed in front of a white table, it will be able to say, I see a white table. Further, if the android puts on the rose-colored glasses over its eyes or its sensory apparatus, it will register that the frequency of light is in the red spectrum, and it will say, now the table looks red. Or it might say, I am having a red table sensation even though I know that the table is really white. So, what's the point of this example? Well, Putnam has showed that there's a built-in logic when it comes to talking about the external world, given that the speaker's knowledge of the world comes through sensory apparatus, like eyes and ears of a human or the visual and audio receptors on a robot. A sophisticated enough android will inevitably draw a distinction between appearance and reality, and thus, it will distinguish between its so-called sensations and objective reality. Now, of course, this may only show that androids of this kind would be capable of speaking as if they have subjective experiences, as if they were really conscious, even though they might not actually be so. Putnam admits this. He says that we have no reason to think that they are conscious, but we also have no reason to think that they're not. Their discourse would be perfectly consistent with their having subjective experiences, and Putnam thinks that it would be something close to discrimination to deny that an android was conscious simply because it was made of metal instead of living cells. In effect, he is saying that androids should be given the benefit of the doubt. In his own words, I have concluded that there is no correct answer to the question, is Oscar the android conscious? Robots may indeed have or lack properties unknown to physics and undetectable by us, but not the slightest reason has been offered to show us that they do, as the robot analogy demonstrates. It is reasonable, then, to conclude that the question that titles this paper, Robots, Machines, or Artificially Created Life, calls for a decision, and not for a discovery. If we are to make decisions, it seems preferable to me to extend our concept so that robots are conscious. For discrimination based on the softness or hardness of the body parts of a synthetic organism seems as silly as discriminatory treatment of humans on the basis of skin color. Since Putnam thinks that there's no evidence one way or the other to settle the question, he says that we must simply decide whether we are going to grant androids the status of conscious beings. He says that we ought to be generous and do so. Not everyone would agree with Putnam on this score. Kurt Baer, for example, disagrees with Putnam, arguing that there would be good reason for thinking that the androids in question are not conscious. Putnam considers two of Baer's objections and tries to speak to them. We do not have the space to consider their debate here. It's not a debate easily settled either. It is interesting to note, however, that Putnam seems to have one interesting philosopher on his side. Captain Picard from our Star Trek episode. We're going to close this discussion with a dramatic scene near the end of the Star Trek episode that we've been following. In an earlier scene, with Guinan played by Whoopi Goldberg, Picard was led to embrace a moral argument in defense of Data. This is an argument that you may find interesting, because it's remarkably similar to Putnam's argument in Spirit.
Do you like Commander Data?
I don't know it well enough to like or dislike it.
But you admire him.
Oh, yes. It is an extraordinary piece
Of engineering and programming, yes, you have said that. Commander, you have devoted your life to the study of cybernetics in general.
Yes.
And Commander Data in particular.
Yes.
And now you propose to dismantle him.
So that I can learn from it and construct more.
How many more?
As many as are needed. Hundreds, thousands if necessary. There is no limit.
A single data, and forgive me, Commander, is a curiosity. A wonder even, but thousands of datas. Isn't that becoming a race? And won't we be judged by how we treat that race? Now tell me, Commander, what is Data?
I don't understand.
What is he?
A machine!
Is he? Are you sure?
Yes!
You see, he's met 2 of your 3 criteria for sentience, so what if he meets the 3rd? Consciousness in even the smallest degree. What is he then? I don't know. Do you? Do you? Do you? Well, that's the question you have to answer. Your Honor, a courtroom is a crucible. In it we burn away irrelevancies until we are left with a pure product, the truth, for all time. Now, sooner or later, this man, or others like him, will succeed in replicating Commander Data. Now, the decision you reach here today will determine how we will regard this creation of our genius. It will reveal the kind of a people we are, what he is destined to be. It will reach far beyond this courtroom and this one android. It could significantly redefine the boundaries of personal liberty and freedom, expanding them for some, savagely curtailing them for others. Are you prepared to condemn him and all who come after him to servitude and slavery? Your Honor, Starfleet was founded to seek out new life. Well, there it sits. Waiting. You wanted a chance to make law. Well, here it is. Make it a good one.
It sits there looking at me, and I don't know what it is. This case has dealt with metaphysics, with questions best left to saints and philosophers. I'm neither competent nor qualified to answer those. But I've got to make a ruling to try to speak to the future. Is Data a machine? Yes. Is he the property of Starfleet? No. We have all been dancing around the basic issue. Does Data have a soul? I don't know that he has. I don't know that I have. But I have got to give him the freedom to explore that question himself. It is the ruling of this court that Lieutenant Commander Data has the freedom to choose.
I formally refuse to undergo your procedure.
I will cancel that transfer order.
Thank you. And Commander, continue your work. When you are ready, I will still be here. I find some of what you propose intriguing.
So, is Commander Data a person? We do not presume to answer that question in this discussion, but we do hope that you've thought through the question a little more deeply than you had before. Now that we've explored some of the complexities of deciding what is and is not a person, as far as robots go, and it's taken us quite a bit of time to get this far even, but there are more things to consider than just robots. As I said before, there are plants, insects, animals, even fetuses, or prisoners. How do we treat them? Are they part of our moral community? What dictates whether or not they are? Are there degrees of personhood? Does someone become less of a person by committing a crime, therefore deserving more punishment? Do they become more of a person when they do good deeds or become helpful to a certain community? Obviously, I don't have time to cover every single issue within this context, but I think we can turn to some Western philosophers and just briefly touch on what their beliefs on this topic are. So in philosophy, the word person refers to various different concepts. According to the naturalist epistemological tradition, from Descartes through Locke and Hume, the term may designate any human or non-human agent which possesses continuous consciousness over time, and who is therefore capable of framing representations about the world, formulating plans, and acting on them. According to Charles Taylor, the problem with the naturalist view is that it depends solely on a performance criteria to describe what is an agent. Thus, other things, such as machines or animals that exhibit similarly complex adaptive behavior, could not be distinguished from persons. Instead, Taylor proposes a significance-based view of personhood. What is crucial about agents is that things matter to them. We can't simply identify agents by a performance criterion, nor assimilate animals to machines. Likewise, there are matters of significance for human beings which are peculiarly human and have no analog with animals. Others, such as American philosopher Francis J. Beckwith, argues that personhood is not linked to function at all, but rather that it is the underlying personal unity of the individual. What is crucial morally is the being of a person, not his or her functioning. A human person does not come into existence when human function arises, but rather a human person is an entity who has the natural inherent capacity to give rise to human functions, whether or not those functions are ever attained. A human person who lacks the ability to think rationally, either because they're too young or suffering from a disability, perhaps they're even in a vegetative state, is still a human person because of their nature. Consequently, it makes sense to speak of a human being's lack, if and only if they are an actual person. Philosopher J.P. Moreland clarifies this point. It's because an entity has an essence and falls within a natural kind that it can possess a unity of dispositions, capacities, parts, and properties that at a given time can maintain identity through change. Harry Frankfurt writes that what philosophers have lately come to accept as analysis of the concept of a person is not actually analysis of that concept at all. He suggests that the concept of a person is intimately connected to free will, and describes the structure of human volition according to first and second order desires. Besides wanting and choosing and being moved to do this or that, humans may also want to have or not to have certain desires and motives. They're capable of wanting to be different in their preferences and purposes from what they are. Many animals appear to have the capacity for what I shall call first-order desires, or desires of the first order, which are simply desires to do or not to do one thing or another. No animal other than man, however, appears to have the capacity for reflective self-evaluation that is manifested in the formation of second-order desires. The criteria for being a person are designed to capture those attributes which are the subject of our most humane concern with ourselves, and the source of what we regard as most important and most problematic in our lives. According to Nicholas Compridis, there might be an intersubjective or interpersonal basis to personhood. What if personal identity is constituted in and sustained through our relations with others, such that were we to erase our relations with our significant others, we would also erase the conditions of our self-intelligibility? As it turns out, this erasure is precisely what is experimentally dramatized in the science fiction film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a far more philosophically sophisticated meditation on personal identity than is found in most of the contemporary literature on the topic. The problem I see with this viewpoint is that it turns personhood into a popularity contest, something that might not be very favorable to some lonely people out there. Other philosophers have defined personhood in different ways. Boethius gives the definition of person as an individual substance of a rational nature. Peter Singer defines a person as being a conscious thinking being which knows that it is a person or has self-awareness. Thomas White argues that the criteria for a person are as follows. 1, it's alive. 2, it's aware. It feels positive and negative sensations. It has emotions, has a sense of self, controls its own behavior, recognizes other persons and treats them appropriately, and has a variety of sophisticated cognitive abilities. While many of White's criteria are somewhat anthropocentric, some animals, such as dolphins, would still be considered persons. Some animal rights groups have also championed recognition for animals as persons. Another approach to personhood, paradigm case formulation, used in descriptive psychology and developed by Peter Osorio, involves the 4 interrelated concepts of the individual person, deliberate action, reality in the real world, and language or verbal behavior. All 4 concepts require full articulation for any one of them to be fully intelligible. More specifically, a person is an individual whose history is paradigmatically a history of deliberate action in a dramaturgical pattern. Deliberate action is a form of behavior in which a person engages in an intentional action, is cognizant of it, and has chosen to do so. A person is not always engaged in a deliberate action, but has the eligibility to do so. A human being is an individual who is both a person and a specimen of Homo sapien. Since persons are deliberate actors, they also employ hedonic, prudent, aesthetic, and ethical reasons when selecting, choosing, or deciding on a course of action. As part of our unspoken social contract, we expect that the typical person can make use of all four of these motivational perspectives. Individual persons will weigh these motives in a manner that reflects their personal characteristics. That life is lived in a dramaturgical pattern is to say that people make sense, that their lives have patterns or significance. The paradigm case allows for non-human persons, potential persons, manufactured persons, formal persons, deficit case persons, and primitive persons. By using a paradigm case methodology, different observers can point to where they agree and where they disagree about whether an entity qualifies as a person. So there are all different sorts of ideas about what constitutes a person, but there's even arguments about where personhood begins. It's a concept long debated by religion and philosophy. With respect to abortion, personhood is the status of a human being having individual human rights. But can we say that a fetus has individual human rights? Does the fetus's rights outweigh the mother's rights if she wants to get an abortion? Who has more personhood in that case? Is it based on experience or age? All this is important to consider because not only do we make laws as a society based off of how we define what a person is, what people are allowed to do, how we're allowed to treat persons, but it's also important to us on an individual level because we may be coming into contact with things that are persons that we don't realize are persons, and treating them in ways that wouldn't be fair if these persons were respected as part of a moral community. And if you decide that something or someone is to be treated with less respect than you would treat a person that you did have respect for, why? You have to be able to explain and answer for that. Personally, I think the safest route to go is to treat everyone and everything with a good degree of respect. Be fair and just to all of the creatures in the world and to the world itself. What do you think about personhood? I would like to hear your individual thoughts on this. I may even carry some of this topic into next week, seeing as it's such a long and open-ended question. Email me at illuminationhour@gmail.com. You've just listened to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen Stallone. See you next week.